Hello everybody, I'm Tom Cherryhome, Systems Operator for IRATA.ONLINE, and I wanted to talk a little bit today about a very neat concept for artists inside the PLATO system called line sets. Line sets are complementary to character sets inside the PLATO system by basically allowing for larger characters other than the default size of 0, which are defined using character sets, to be specified as a series of vectors or line drawings. The way in which this is implemented inside the PLATO system almost makes it as if to support proportional font sizes, and this is exactly how I'm using it inside the system now. To do ahead with this demonstration, we will actually go and use the individual sections of, we'll actually use two windows here to help us out. On top we have a P-term window, and behind it we actually have a window in GIMP, which we can actually use to do our drawing and guide work. We have here, I'm actually going to take and bounce out real quick. In the IRATA.ONLINE system, I have a lesson here that I'm working on called IRATA, which can be thought of as a shared library for all sorts of graphic resources that can be used in other lessons inside the system. You can do the same for others as well. If you want to have bits and pieces that other people can use, you can share them with other people just as well. We go into the IRATA lesson, and we see that we have, in addition to the usual suspects, the directory here, we have a description here, which is actually just a description of what this particular library is. We also have here a set of blocks called IRATA font, which have lines out next to them. Similar to having chars for character set blocks, you can create line set blocks in the same way. Instead of selecting tutor or character sets, you specify that you want a line set block. Once we select it, we see that we have a line set editor for IRATA font, and we have the option to edit it, change the name, or destroy it. We'll go ahead and edit it. And in here we have a series of options that are similar to the character set editor. We have a list of slots used, a list of slots available. We have normal line char design, large grid line char design, deleting a line char, making a copy of a line char. If we hit next for additional options, we see some additional things as well, such as copying from other line sets, setting the same ending position for all the line chars. Use a character set in designing the line chars, which allows you to link a character set to view while you're editing the line chars so you can have a reference to work against. Or you can change the size of all the line chars, or finally take the line chars that you've drawn here and turn them into relative draw commands. Go ahead and go back to the beginning here. We go ahead and look at slots used. And for this particular font, you'll notice right here off the bat that we have all of the letters and all of the numbers defined. And we're starting to define some of the symbols. And in fact, part of this tutorial video will actually go through the process of drawing one of these characters and positioning it so that it will work correctly as a line set, as a line char and a line set. If we look at one of these characters, for example, let's look at the capital A. If we try to look at it from here, we see that it's just a normal line char design here. And in fact, I'll actually kind of take a step back and show here. If we select normal line char design and we pick a particular character, we'll see that this is only part of a line char. In fact, it's exactly one quadrant. And you can see that there's just enough here that roughly corresponds to the same size as a typical character set design. We also have what is called large grid line care design, which gives you 4 quadrants worth of information that you can put together, as well as the ability to use much finer grained pixel sizes. This is what I use for the character set. Looking at it, we can see the drawing here for the character A. We have here a set of grid lines to help us out, small dots for the fine positioning here, and larger dots for the traditional line care sets, which correspond exactly to the dots that you saw in the regular line care editing mode. You also see here a relative sizing to a standard character here as a basis of reference. We can see here, if we take and move the cursor using our cursor keys or the cursor letters on a PLATO keyboard, we can move the cursor around. And editing works much the same way as it does, for example, in the screen editor, with the exception that it's not as fine-grained. And of course, like the screen editor here, we see that it doesn't automatically redraw once you've moved over a particular area. This is fine, and all you really have to do is press data to replot. We have the most common tools here, which we'll go over in just a minute. Skip to point, which means place a new point in a particular place, but don't draw to it. P to draw to a given point. This is what you use most of the time to lay down individual lines. A capital R to remove a line, and I to inspect what you've done, so at any time you can hit I, give it a given size. If you just hit enter, by default it's size 1, and whether or not you want to rotate it. So we can see in different sizes, different orientations. Say twice as big, rotated 45 degrees, and so on. We can also do certain things like place other line set characters in here as for a relative reference, and we can say move cursor to the desired position here. I want to display the B character here and place it, for example, right here. Press next, and we can see that it has placed the B character here for display. Maybe a little closer here so you can see how the kerning lines up, and so on. Lots of little tricks that you can see here, and I've went through and actually designed and actually drew all of these characters here one by one and then placed them. Now the next section of this particular tutorial is going to show how I actually did that. We need to add some additional characters. I've gone ahead and added one of the symbols here, the question mark. We can go ahead and add an exclamation point to start with. So in the editor, if we choose a key that we haven't defined yet, it will automatically set aside the space for us. Do the exclamation point. We see that it's an exclamation point here, character number 124, and we can start drawing. Now, as part of the illustrative process, it is very nice to have some tools to really help you along with that process. And to that effect, I have GIMP here to help me with that process. And I have a nice little tool called Window Top. I highly recommend you grab a copy of Window Top if you're running Windows, or use the equivalent program in Mac OS, because it allows you to set an opacity for a given window. So if I click on the handle here, bring up the opacity here, I can bring down the opacity for a window so that I can see behind it. And this allows me to treat windows essentially as onion skin that's used by animators or by cell designers to draw over. And that is exactly how I use it here. So to this particular method, I'm going to go ahead and we'll see how this lines up with the grid here. you'll notice that this window has already had its opacity turned down just a little bit, just enough to see the grid lines. And you can see a grid line here for the edge of the window here, which I've placed, as well as the edge of this particular window here. Now, I already defined a particular baseline based on the first character that I drew in the system, and I placed the baseline right here. This is important because, especially when you're designing proportional fonts, you need to be able to place every character on roughly the same baseline. And in fact, I did this after I really learned more about how the system laid everything out. And if I had actually, if I had this to do over again, I would actually move the baseline up just a little bit so that we could have characters with descenders underneath it. But, you know, it happened. I'll go back and fix it later. So we go ahead. We have our line set up. Let's go into GIMP. And I will drop down a particular character. Right now I've got the question mark in here. Use the text tool. And I will place the exclamation point and remove the other character. And since we're already pretty much setting on the baseline here, we're right where we need to be. We might want to take and move it down just a tiny bit to fit, to match, no problem. We're sitting on the baseline. We're pretty much ready to go. And in actuality, what I will do now is I will bring down the opacity on this window so I can see the grid back behind. Turn up the opacity on this guy so I can see behind him, and go back into GIMP here, and I will reposition. You'll notice that even though I've turned down the opacity on this window, and even though I can see behind it, I can still see the grids over here, so I can position my character where it needs to go within the grid here. And since the center of this grid corresponds to the current cursor position, I have decided to standardize on centering the characters within the quadrants. Roughly here, that's fine. Now we go ahead, turn this guy back all the way up, go back to the terminal, and turn this guy down. We'll turn him down a little bit, something like that. And now we'll start drawing. This character will be relatively easy to draw. Actually it'll be roughly half and half, as we've got straight lines for the top of the exclamation and a roughly round shape for the bottom of the exclamation, for the dot and the exclamation point. We start by placing the first point using P. And we can see that it's placed a square here, indicating that this is the start of this particular part of the graphic. When we hit skip for in a moment to go down to the circle, that square will change appropriately. Now you have to make a certain judgment call here. You'll notice that even with this particular font spacing here, it doesn't exactly line up with the grid spacing of these dots. It's a little bit larger. So I opted to go a little bit below to cut off just a tiny sliver up top so that all this matches up. We go ahead and lay down a point. We lay down another point. Again, using the same technique here. We laid down another point, and the final point for the box. So there's the top of the exclamation point. Now we can go all the way over to start of the circle and hit S to skip a point to make a new origin point here for the circle. And for this, it's the same tricks that you would use trying to specify a curve using a whole bunch of lines. And you can make those lines really small, or you can make them large enough to handle whatever the slope of the given line is here. This should be sufficient. We'll go ahead and circle. And you can see here that this works because the resolution of the PLATO terminal is less than the resolution of my display, so it's approximating quite well. And even though it'll look somewhat exaggerated here, it will look just fine when I take and render it out at what it considers to be size 1. So we have this piece here now. We have this particular character pretty much done. We can inspect it to see how it looks. And as you can see, there's our exclamation point, and it looks pretty good. We can, at this point, back out, go back into the editor, and we need to really do one more thing, and that's basically to specify when this character is done plotting, how far is it going to move the cursor forward, and to that we need to specify an endpoint. If we actually look in help, we'll see the rest of the commands. We can see facilities for editing the individual lines. The command to replot, shift data, which means revert back to the original, shift lab to go to normal design, or the normal editor that we saw earlier. We can toggle the grid on and off. We can only edit in particular quadrants, and so on. In our case, we are interested in to set in position, so we hit lab. And for that, you actually are going to have to be doing this a few different times with each character that you make in order to set an effective value for kerning purposes. And when you're making your fonts or whatever you're making inside of here, it's a good idea to kern things as tight as you possibly can, even to the point where text might be touching together in some cases, because you can use spacing to loosen up the kerning. And this is still taking up much less space than if you were to take and draw these things individually. So the trade-off is okay. We'll go ahead and say I want to hit lab, move cursor to desired position, press next, boom, and now we see that the endpoint is right there, as noticed by the caret that it dropped down right here. We will go ahead and go back and back. Now you'll notice that one of the features at the bottom of the screen here is lab to try out your line cares. This is a wonderful feature to see how individual letters and all your different bits of your font will actually take and work out our line set. We press it, we go into line care inspect mode, which means now we have size and screen position. We can go ahead and turn up the opacity here to get rid of the rest of that. We go ahead and hit enter because we want to see it size 1, and screen position we'll pick 1210, which will put the cursor roughly about right there. So now we can start typing, and if we press the character that we made, we can see that it's placed it right there, and the cursor is scooted over a little bit, and we can see that it placed that we did actually a pretty decent positioning of that character to start off with. If you think it needs to be placed out further, you can go back, re-edit the character, press lab, and reset the end position, but this seems to be fine. So I will go ahead and we'll try some things here. Lowercase h, high. And you'll see I hit space before that, which loosens the kerning a little bit. If I don't, you see it comes in a little bit closer to that. Let's go ahead and test the exclamation point next to that. Well, as you can see, it's a little bit out there as far as the eye is concerned. And what this ultimately tells me here is that I need to go ahead and alter the kerning spacing of the eye a little bit. So we can go ahead and go back and do that. And I'm okay with this again because, like I said, you can use spacing to adjust the kerning to go outward. So try to set your endpoints to be the tightest possible that you can actually set it. You go ahead and go back into large grid design here. And if you find that keys aren't working, if you come back to the editor, make sure that you have caps lock disengaged, because the commands are lowercase. So enter line care key. We want to change the I. That's the capital I. Let's change the lowercase I. We can see the caret for the lowercase I here, and I will actually put this back here a little bit. Let's put it right back here. Go here, and we'll test again. Lab. And you can see the ligature on that is much better. When you're building your fonts, especially fonts that you're intending to be proportional, you need to test the different combinations of letters to see how they'll actually fit together. You'll see that this is actually tight, and you'll think, oh no, that's wrong, but that's okay, because you can tighten it up or loosen it up like you need it to be. Sorry. So you can see complementary. Let's go ahead and try and see, this is where I messed up as far as the descenders were concerned, but that's fine. And you can see I'm typing space in certain cases to make things loosen up a little bit. But when you're done, this is essentially what you're trying to go after. And the reason that you do this, ultimately, why you spend so much time trying to make these line sets, is so that when you're working in your code, and we'll go ahead and make a demo here, like a tutor block. Go ahead and call this unit demo, and it comes from this lesson, and it's IRATA font, and we will set the size to 1 at 1210, sure, right. Done. Oops. Excuse me. Actually, wrong size. Let me go ahead and fix that. Let me see here. I have to use the font key. Oops. Or use Alt font. My bad. This is what happens when I'm improvising in a demo. Things go sideways. So I'll go ahead and add a line here for Alt font on. Which, in case you're wondering what that's about, if we go ahead and go into help and we get Alt font, it means turn on the alternate font as a permanent toggle. This is normally what you would use the font key for, but this does it in code. And it really helps for line sets, because it doesn't draw line sets in the editor, only character sets. So knowing this, we go ahead, set the size, set the position, set Alt font on, and now we've just implemented this using the character set that's already there, without having to take and go into the screen designer and draw it out again. Very handy. And the reason I said spacing was important, especially trying to make sure that your kerning is as tight as possible, is so that when you want to make a change, let's go back here to the Atari here, and I actually want to change the spacing between the second A and the R. For that, we'll go back. Go into Demo, Replace here. And this simulates opening up, just loosening up the kerning a bit, and you'll see the difference. See? And in fact, this might be an excuse to actually take and tighten up the endpoint on the A so that the T can come a bit closer. So now I hope that this has been a very quick introduction to the concept of line sets and why they are extremely useful in doing things like large titles and whatnot for your individual lessons that you write on the system. But when you combine them with character sets, you find that you have a great deal of recyclable and reusable flexibility for laying out your designs, especially topographical designs, very quickly. If you haven't already, go ahead and watch the tutorial video on using character sets, as it is a complementary to this and shows the character set editor and how it is useful for doing both small scale fonts like what you see here on the beginning, as well as doing bitmap graphics for games and lessons and the like. So until next time, guys, enjoy the system.